The air in Madrid was hot and still, thick with the scent of city life. People moved quickly through the streets, rushing toward their destinations, but within the suffocating silence of the abandoned school basement, time seemed to freeze. Veronica Alvarez sat cross-legged on the cold cement floor, her fingers gently tracing the smooth, ancient wood of the Ouija board laid out before her. The room was dark, save for the flickering glow of 3 candles, their soft light casting dancing shadows against the cracked walls. She glanced at her best friend Rosa, who shifted nervously beside her, biting her lip as she fidgeted with the hem of her sweater. Rosa's anxious eyes darted around the dimly lit room, her hands trembling slightly as she hovered them over the board. "I don't like this, Veronica," Rosa whispered, her voice barely above a breath. "This place gives me the creeps." Veronica offered her a reassuring smile. "It's just a bit of fun. You're not scared of a silly game, are you?" Rosa didn't respond, but her discomfort was obvious. It had taken some convincing to get her down here in the first place, and now that they were deep in the bowels of the school, the atmosphere felt oppressive, almost too heavy to ignore. The air was damp with the scent of mildew, and the walls seemed to press inward, like a tomb closing in around them. Lucia, Veronica's younger sister, sat on her other side, her wide eyes sparkling with a mixture of excitement and fear. At 13, Lucia was always eager to tag along with her older sister, even when it meant venturing into places that held an unnatural eeriness. To her, the Ouija board was just another game, an opportunity to bond with her sister and experience something thrilling. Veronica wasn't so sure anymore that it was just a game. Ever since their father had died, her fascination with the occult had grown into something far deeper, something darker. She had read about the power of the Ouija board in one of the old occult books she'd found hidden away in her grandmother's attic. It promised answers, connections with the dead, something Veronica craved more than anything. "I just want to try it," Veronica said, her voice soft but commanding. "We'll ask a few questions, and if nothing happens, we can go home. Simple as that." Rosa sighed, glancing at the only exit, a rusty iron door that seemed too heavy for any of them to move quickly in a panic. But reluctantly, she nodded. "All right," she whispered. "Let's just get this over with." The 3 girls placed their fingers lightly on the planchette, the small wooden heart-shaped tool that would guide them. The air grew colder, the silence so thick that even the faintest sound of their breaths echoed against the concrete. A strange energy filled the room as they waited, an invisible tension that made each second feel like an hour. Veronica cleared her throat, trying to steady her nerves. "Is anyone here with us?" she asked in a calm, measured tone. Her eyes locked on the board, waiting for a sign, any sign, that they weren't alone. For a moment, nothing happened. The planchette sat still under their fingers, lifeless. Rosa's tension began to ease, a slight smile forming on her lips as she prepared to make a joke about how ridiculous this all was. But then, the planchette jerked, violently sliding across the board. Lucia gasped, her hands flying to her mouth. Rosa's face went pale, and Veronica's heart skipped a beat. The planchette moved slowly, deliberately, as if an unseen force was guiding it. They watched in stunned silence as it began to spell out a name. "Manuel, Manuel," Rosa whispered, her voice barely audible over the pounding of her heart. "Do you know someone by that name?" Veronica shook her head slowly. "No," she replied, her eyes glued to the board. "I don't." The room seemed to grow even colder, the air heavy with something dark and malevolent. Lucia shuddered, wrapping her arms around herself as if trying to ward off an unseen chill. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to stretch and grow, creeping closer to the circle of candlelight. "What do you want?" Veronica asked, her voice trembling despite her attempts to sound brave. The planchette moved again, faster this time, as though whatever spirit they had contacted was growing impatient. D-O-O-M. Rosa's breath hitched. She pulled her hands away from the board, breaking the connection. "That's it, Veronica. I'm done," she snapped, her voice trembling with fear. "This isn't funny anymore. We need to leave." But Veronica couldn't move. Her fingers were frozen on the planchette, her eyes wide and unblinking. Something wasn't right. Something had shifted in the room, something far more dangerous than she had ever imagined. Lucia grabbed her sister's arm. "Veronica, let's go," she pleaded, her voice rising in panic. Veronica finally pulled herself away from the board, the spell broken. Her hands shook as she stood up, backing away from the circle of candles. The candles flickered violently, and one by one they were snuffed out, as if some unseen force had blown them out all at once. In the sudden darkness, the girls scrambled to their feet, hearts racing as they fumbled for the door. Their footsteps echoed in the empty basement as they bolted up the stairs, desperate to escape the oppressive shadows that now seemed to swallow the room. But just as Veronica reached the top of the stairwell, she made the mistake of looking back. For a split second, she saw something or someone standing in the far corner of the basement, its form barely visible in the dim light. It was a man, his face obscured by shadow, his eyes hollow and dark, watching her. His mouth twisted into a grin as Veronica's blood ran cold. She stumbled out into the daylight, her heart pounding in her chest. The others were already outside, panting heavily as they leaned against the wall, their faces pale with fear. "Did you see him?" Veronica whispered, her voice shaking as she looked back at the dark entrance to the basement. Rosa and Lucia exchanged a glance but shook their heads. "See who?" Rosa asked, her voice barely more than a whisper. Veronica didn't answer. She knew what she had seen, and it wasn't a figment of her imagination. The image of the figure standing in the corner burned itself into her mind, and she knew, deep down, that this was far from over. As they walked away from the school, Veronica couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed her. Something dark, something relentless. She could feel it, a cold presence lingering just out of sight, whispering her name in the shadows. And then she remembered the last word the board had spelled out, the word that made her blood run cold. Doom. Veronica shivered, knowing that whatever they had summoned, it was only just beginning. The days after the séance passed slowly, yet a strange tension clung to the air like a damp mist that refused to lift. At first, Veronica convinced herself that it had all been an overreaction, just a silly game, heightened by the shadows of an old basement and her own nerves. She tried to laugh it off with Rosa and Lucia, but the smile didn't reach her eyes. The lingering dread was harder to shake. It began with small things, barely noticeable at first. Books shifted ever so slightly on the shelf, as if someone had moved them when no one was looking. Light bulbs flickered without explanation, plunging Veronica into brief moments of darkness before buzzing back to life. She dismissed it all as coincidence, everyday annoyances heightened by her overactive imagination. But the unease grew, creeping through the corners of her mind like a slow-moving fog. Her dreams, however, were where the real torment began. Each night she would wake up in a cold sweat, her heart hammering in her chest, vivid images lingering just behind her eyelids. In her dreams, Veronica found herself standing alone in the school's basement again, surrounded by oppressive shadows. The smell of damp concrete filled her lungs as she walked slowly toward the corner where she had seen him. The figure whose face she couldn't fully remember, but whose presence felt more real than anything else. He would be there just as before, his eyes hollow, his grin menacing. He never moved, just watched, silent, patient. Then there were the whispers. They were faint at first, barely discernible. At night, just as Veronica was drifting into sleep, she would hear them, soft, distant murmurs that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. She strained to make out the words, but they eluded her, like fragments of a conversation just out of earshot. She tried to ignore them, telling herself it was only the wind, or perhaps the echo of the city through the walls of her small apartment. But as the nights passed, the whispers grew louder, more insistent. They followed her everywhere, in her room, at school, even in the silence of the kitchen when she stood alone in the middle of the night, too restless to sleep. She found herself constantly glancing over her shoulder, convinced that someone was standing just behind her, watching, waiting. Lucia, too, had been affected. The once lively 13-year-old had grown quieter, her playful energy now replaced with a haunted look in her eyes. She refused to sleep in her own room, instead creeping into Veronica's bed in the middle of the night, shaking uncontrollably from nightmares she couldn't explain. "He's watching us," Lucia whispered one night as she clung to her older sister under the covers. Her voice was small, but there was a deep, unnatural fear in it that sent chills down Veronica's spine. "Who's watching us?" Veronica asked, though she already knew the answer. Lucia hesitated, her breath shallow as if speaking the words would make them real. "The man from the basement. I see him in my dreams. He's always there, watching, waiting." Veronica stiffened but forced a weak smile, hoping to comfort her sister even though she felt the same cold terror gnawing at her insides. "It's just your imagination," she said, though she hardly believed her own words. Lucia shook her head violently. "No, it's not. He's real, Veronica. I know he is. He said he was coming for you." The room seemed to grow colder, and Veronica felt a familiar knot of dread tightening in her stomach. She tried to reassure Lucia, but deep down she feared her sister was right. Things only escalated from there. One evening, while their mother was still at work, the sisters sat together watching television in the living room. It was a desperate attempt to feel normal again, to drown out the creeping unease with laughter from some mindless show. But just as they began to settle in, the power cut out abruptly, plunging the room into darkness. Veronica fumbled for the flashlight she kept on the nearby table, her hands trembling as she flicked it on. The beam of light cut through the darkness, casting long shadows across the walls. Lucia whimpered beside her, clutching Veronica's arm tightly. "It's just a blackout," Veronica said, trying to sound calm, though her heart was pounding in her chest. "It happens all the time. I'll go check the fuse box." As she stood up and made her way to the hallway, something felt off, more than just the darkness or the power outage. The air felt heavy, thick with an oppressive presence she couldn't quite name. The silence was suffocating, broken only by the faint hum of the flashlight in her hand. When she reached the fuse box, Veronica noticed something that sent ice down her spine. The box wasn't tripped. The switches were all in the correct position. She flipped them back and forth, but nothing happened. The house remained shrouded in darkness. And then she heard it. Soft, barely audible, but unmistakable. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, moving from the hallway toward the living room. Veronica's breath caught in her throat. She wasn't alone. She turned, shining the flashlight down the hallway, but there was nothing there. Only the deep shadows, stretching further than they should have in the narrow space. "Lucia," she called out, her voice trembling. "Is that you?" Lucia didn't answer. Panic rising in her chest, Veronica hurried back to the living room. But when she reached the doorway, she stopped dead in her tracks. Lucia was still sitting on the couch, but her eyes were wide with fear, locked onto something behind Veronica. Veronica slowly turned around. The flashlight beam wavered as her hands shook, and for a moment she thought she saw it. The shadowy figure of a man standing at the far end of the hallway, just out of reach of the light. His eyes gleamed in the darkness, two pinpricks of malevolent energy that pierced through her like icy needles. She blinked and the figure was gone. "Did you see him?" Lucia whispered, her voice trembling. Veronica nodded slowly, her heart racing. "I saw him," she admitted, her voice barely more than a whisper. That night, Veronica lay awake, staring at the ceiling as the whispers grew louder in her mind. She could no longer deny what was happening. Something had come for her, something dark, something malevolent. And it wasn't going to leave until it had taken everything. The presence that had followed them home from the séance wasn't just haunting their dreams anymore. It was here, in the house, watching them, waiting for the right moment to strike. Veronica could feel it, like a weight pressing down on her chest, suffocating her with fear. And the worst part, she knew deep down that this was only the beginning. The next day, Rosa refused to come over. She had been avoiding Veronica at school, casting nervous glances in her direction, but never getting too close. When Veronica confronted her, Rosa was blunt. "I'm sorry, Veronica, but I can't do this anymore. That night, that thing, it's following you. I don't want it near me." Veronica couldn't blame her. She had seen it too. The dark figure, the whispers, the cold presence that clung to her like a shadow. It was as though Manuel, or whatever they had summoned, had latched onto her and refused to let go. As she walked home that evening, Veronica felt it again, the sensation of being watched. She glanced over her shoulder, half expecting to see the figure standing there, waiting in the distance. But there was nothing, only the empty street behind her. Yet the feeling persisted, like icy fingers brushing against the back of her neck. Veronica hurried home, her heart racing as she fumbled with her keys at the front door. She stepped inside and locked the door behind her, but the sense of relief never came. The house was dark and quiet, too quiet, as though something sinister lingered just out of sight. As she climbed the stairs to her room, the whispers returned, louder now, more insistent. They filled her head, a cacophony of voices that spoke her name, beckoning her closer to the darkness. She clamped her hands over her ears, trying to block them out, but they only grew louder, wrapping around her like tendrils of shadow. Veronica collapsed onto her bed, her breath coming in shallow gasps. She squeezed her eyes shut, willing the voices to stop, but they didn't. They whispered terrible things, threats, promises of doom and suffering. And through it all, one voice stood out, cold and familiar. "Manuel, I'm coming for you." Veronica's eyes snapped open, her body trembling with fear. She wasn't sure how much longer she could endure this. The haunting had begun, and it wasn't just her who was in danger. It was everyone she cared about. As she lay there in the darkness, the whispers swirling around her, one thing became terrifyingly clear. The nightmare was far from over. Veronica stood in front of the bathroom mirror, gripping the edge of the sink so tightly her knuckles turned white. Her reflection stared back at her, but something was wrong. Terribly wrong. Her face looked pale, gaunt, her once bright eyes sunken and rimmed with dark circles. She hardly recognized herself. It had been weeks since the séance, weeks of endless nightmares, whispers that never ceased, and the creeping sensation that something malevolent was lurking in every shadow. She tried to breathe deeply, to calm herself, but her chest felt tight as though an invisible hand was pressing down on her lungs. She splashed water on her face, trying to shake the mounting dread. The cold liquid shocked her system, momentarily grounding her, but as she blinked away the droplets, she saw it. The figure. For a split second, he was standing behind her in the mirror, his hollow eyes boring into her. Manuel. Veronica whipped around, her breath catching in her throat. The bathroom was empty. Her hands trembled as she reached out, touching the spot where she had seen him. She felt nothing but air. Still, her heart wouldn't slow, and the suffocating feeling of being watched clung to her like a second skin. She had seen him too many times to count now, always just on the edge of her vision, always lurking in the shadows. At first, she had thought it was just her mind playing tricks on her, a result of stress and lack of sleep. But it wasn't just in her head. The sightings had grown more frequent, more vivid, until they no longer felt like hallucinations. She could feel him, his presence, his cold, hungry stare. He was real. Veronica hadn't slept properly in days. Every time she closed her eyes, he was there, waiting in her dreams. Her nights were filled with dark, suffocating nightmares. She was back in the school basement, trapped in that cold, damp space, unable to escape the relentless darkness that surrounded her. And Manuel was always there, in the corner, watching her with that twisted grin that made her blood run cold. Her mother had begun to notice. "You look awful, Veronica," she said one morning, as Veronica sat at the kitchen table, her eyes glazed over, staring at the cup of coffee in front of her. "You're not sleeping, are you?" Veronica didn't answer. How could she explain what was happening? That something was stalking her, haunting her every waking moment, and even in her sleep, that she felt like she was losing her mind. Her mother sighed, her face lined with exhaustion. "I'm worried about you. Maybe you should talk to someone. A therapist, maybe." Veronica glanced up, her mouth opening to say something, anything, but the words died in her throat. There was no one she could talk to. Who would believe her? That some dark entity had attached itself to her, dragging her into madness. She simply nodded, letting the conversation drop, and retreated to her room. But even in the sanctuary of her own space, she couldn't escape him. The whispers followed her everywhere now, loud and incessant. Sometimes they were soft, like the murmurs of a distant conversation, but other times they were sharp, angry, filling her head with malicious threats. She couldn't concentrate on anything. Her schoolwork lay untouched on her desk, forgotten as her mind spiraled deeper into the abyss. Rosa had stopped speaking to her altogether. She avoided Veronica at school, her once friendly face now filled with a mixture of fear and resentment. Veronica had tried to explain what was happening, but Rosa didn't want to hear it. "You brought this on yourself," she had said, her voice cold and distant. "Whatever's happening to you, it's because of that stupid séance. You shouldn't have messed with it." Rosa was right. Veronica knew it, but it was too late. The damage had been done, and there was no undoing it. The blackouts began shortly after. At first, they were short, only a few minutes here and there. She would be sitting in class or walking down the street, and suddenly, everything would go dark. When she came to, she would find herself in a different place, disoriented and confused. But then, they grew longer. One day, she blacked out while walking home from school and woke up hours later in the old school basement, her hands scraped and bloody as if she had been digging at the concrete walls. She had no memory of how she got there or what she had been doing. Panic gripped her chest as she stumbled out of the basement, her mind racing with fear. It was as though her body was no longer her own, as if Manuel had taken control, using her as a puppet for his twisted will. The next blackout was worse. She woke up in her backyard, standing over a deep hole she had dug in the earth with her bare hands. Dirt caked her fingernails, and her clothes were covered in mud. Her body ached, her muscles screaming in protest, but she had no memory of digging the hole. She stared down into the darkness, her heart pounding. What had she been digging for? What was Manuel making her do? Veronica's mind was unraveling, and she knew it. The line between reality and nightmare was blurring, and she could no longer trust her own thoughts. Every time she tried to focus, the whispers would start again, pulling her deeper into the madness. She could feel Manuel's presence inside her, like a dark, festering wound that refused to heal. He was inside her head now, controlling her, twisting her thoughts into something dark and terrifying. She began to see him everywhere, in the mirrors, in the reflections of windows, even in her peripheral vision as she walked through her house. He was always there, just out of reach, watching her with those empty, soulless eyes. His whispers grew louder, more insistent, driving her towards something she couldn't understand. One night, after another blackout, Veronica woke to find a letter waiting for her on her desk. Her heart froze as she saw the jagged handwriting scrawled across the paper in dark, almost frantic strokes. Veronica. The letter was from him. "You can't run from me." Her hands shook as she read the words, her eyes wide with fear. The letter detailed horrific acts, promises of violence, threats of what was to come. The more she read, the more nauseous she felt. He was taunting her, playing with her mind, breaking her down piece by piece. "I will take everything from you." She crumpled the letter in her hands and threw it away, her chest heaving with terror. But when she woke the next morning, the letter was back, neatly placed on her pillow, as though it had never been touched. The same haunting words stared back at her. Veronica was losing control. She could no longer tell what was real and what was an illusion. The whispers in her head grew louder, more insistent, until she could hear them even when she was awake, gnawing at her sanity. Her reflection in the mirror no longer looked like her. It was a twisted version of herself, dark and distorted, with Manuel's grin stretched across her lips. She tried to fight it. She tried to push him out of her mind, to reclaim her body and her thoughts. But it was too late. He was inside her now, controlling her, every movement, every thought. She could feel him, lurking just beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to take over completely. And then came the final straw. One evening, Veronica's mother found her standing in front of the shattered mirror, her hands dripping with blood. She didn't remember breaking it, didn't remember the sharp glass slicing into her skin. Her mother screamed, rushing toward her, but Veronica felt nothing. She was numb, her mind drifting somewhere far away, lost in the darkness that had consumed her. Veronica stared at her reflection in the remaining shards of the mirror. She didn't recognize the face staring back at her. It wasn't her. It was Manuel. His cold, lifeless eyes stared back at her, and his voice echoed in her mind. "Soon," he whispered. "Soon you will be mine." Veronica fell to her knees, her body shaking with uncontrollable sobs. She couldn't fight him anymore. He had taken over, and the terrifying realization sank in. She was no longer in control of her own body. Manuel had won. As the storm raged outside, pounding against the windows with an unrelenting fury, the sky was a deep, churning gray, and lightning cut through the darkness in jagged streaks, illuminating the house in flashes of eerie, otherworldly light. Inside, the house was cold, far colder than it should have been. The air hung heavy with dread, thick with a tension that felt almost alive, like it was waiting for something terrible to happen. Veronica stood at the edge of her bed, staring at the reflection in the small shard of glass she had salvaged from the broken mirror. The face staring back at her was barely recognizable. Her skin was pale, her cheeks sunken, and her eyes were hollow, almost lifeless, as though the soul behind them was slipping away piece by piece. Manuel had been wearing her down for weeks now, eating away at her mind like a parasite, and Veronica could feel him, inside her, crawling beneath her skin, twisting her thoughts until she no longer knew where she ended and he began. She was exhausted. Her body ached, and her mind felt like it was unraveling, threads coming loose one by one until there was nothing left to hold her together. The whispers had stopped, but somehow that was worse. The silence was deafening, like the calm before a storm, the moment when everything goes still, just before the world tears itself apart. Veronica knew deep down that this was the end game. The darkness she had been fighting for so long was closing in around her, tightening its grip, ready to claim what it had come for. She glanced toward the door, her heart racing. Her mother was still at work, and Lucia was asleep in her room down the hall. They were both safe for now, but that safety was fragile, teetering on the edge of a cliff. Veronica had tried to protect them, tried to shield them from the darkness that had seeped into her life. But Manuel was no longer content with haunting her. He wanted everything, her mind, her body, her soul, and once he had her, he would go after them too. Veronica couldn't let that happen. She wouldn't let that happen. She moved toward the door, her footsteps slow and deliberate, her legs heavy as though they were carrying the weight of the world. She had spent hours researching, looking for a way out, some way to break free from the dark hold Manuel had over her. But there was nothing. No spell, no prayer, no exorcism that could banish him. He was inside her now, a part of her. There was no escaping that. Veronica reached the kitchen and pulled out the drawer where her mother kept the sharpest knives. Her hand hovered over them, her fingers trembling as she picked one up. The blade gleamed in the dim light of the kitchen, and for a moment she saw her reflection in its smooth, cold surface, her own face staring back at her, distorted by the curve of the blade. Her heart pounded in her chest as she weighed the knife in her hand. Could she really do this? Was this the only way to stop him? Her mind screamed at her to stop, to put the knife down, to find another way. But there was no time left. She could feel Manuel stirring inside her, stronger than ever, as though he knew what she was planning and was trying to stop her. He's going to win. A voice whispered in her mind, her own voice, but twisted, corrupted by the darkness that had taken root there. You can't stop him. He's too strong. You're too weak. Tears blurred Veronica's vision as she fought against the voice, fought against the rising tide of despair that threatened to drown her. She gripped the knife tighter, her hands shaking as she lifted it to her chest, the blade pressing lightly against her skin. If she couldn't fight him, if she couldn't banish him, then maybe this was the only way to stop him from taking over completely. Maybe this was the only way to save her family. But just as she began to press the blade deeper, she felt it. The cold, familiar presence of Manuel, stronger than ever. It was as though he was wrapping himself around her, pulling her back from the edge, whispering soothing words in her mind. "No," he said, his voice soft, almost gentle. "Not like this, Veronica. This isn't how it ends." The knife slipped from her hands, clattering to the floor with a hollow sound that echoed through the empty house. Veronica gasped, her body shaking as Manuel's presence flooded her mind, his cold laughter ringing in her ears. She collapsed to her knees, clutching her head as the world around her blurred and twisted. "It's time," Manuel whispered, his voice cold and commanding. "Let go, Veronica. You can't fight me anymore." Veronica wanted to scream, wanted to claw him out of her mind, but she was too tired, too weak. She could feel him taking over, like a dark shadow creeping through her veins, seeping into every corner of her being. Her vision darkened and her body went numb as Manuel's presence consumed her, overwhelming her senses until there was nothing left but him. She was no longer in control, he was. And as she stood up, her body moving of its own accord, Veronica knew that she was lost. Manuel had won. Her mind screamed in terror, but her body betrayed her, moving with an eerie grace as Manuel guided her toward Lucia's room. She tried to stop herself, tried to pull back, but it was like she was trapped in her own body, a prisoner in the deepest recesses of her mind. Lucia was asleep, her small form curled up under the covers, her breathing soft and even. Veronica, no, Manuel, stood over her, the shadows of the room stretching long and dark across the floor. He knelt beside the bed, his lips curling into a twisted smile as he reached out to touch her, his fingers brushing lightly against her hair. Veronica screamed in her mind, begging him to stop, but her body didn't listen. Manuel's laughter filled her head, cruel and mocking, as he leaned closer to Lucia, his breath cold against her cheek. But then, something strange happened. Lucia stirred, her eyes fluttering open as though she had sensed the presence standing over her. For a moment, she stared up at Veronica, confusion clouding her sleepy gaze. And then Lucia whispered a single word, "Stop." It wasn't loud, it wasn't forceful, but somehow it was enough. Veronica felt something shift inside her, something small but powerful. Manuel recoiled, his grip on her mind loosening just for a moment, and in that brief second of clarity, Veronica surged forward, fighting with every last ounce of strength she had left. "This is my body," she screamed in her mind, her voice rising above the darkness. "You can't have it," Manuel snarled, his presence clinging to her like a shadow. But Veronica fought harder, pushing him back, forcing him out of her mind, her soul. Her body shook violently as she wrestled for control, her muscles tensing with the effort. "You're mine," Manuel hissed, his voice filled with rage. "You can't stop me." But Veronica did stop him. With one final, desperate push, she forced him out of her mind, out of her body, out of her very soul. She collapsed to the floor, gasping for breath, her heart racing, her entire body trembling from the effort. The air in the room felt lighter, the oppressive weight that had been crushing her chest now gone. Manuel was gone. Lucia sat up, her wide eyes filled with tears as she reached out to her sister. "Veronica," she whispered, her voice trembling. Veronica pulled Lucia into her arms, hugging her tightly as tears streamed down her face. She had won. She had saved them both. But as she held her sister, Veronica couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't truly over. Manuel was gone. For now. But deep down, she knew he wasn't truly defeated. He was out there, waiting, watching, lurking in the shadows. And one day he would return. But for now, Veronica held on to her sister, breathing in the fragile peace of the moment. For now, she was free. For now,